welcome aboard, everyone. This is the second of our 5-part webinar series designed to demystify construction contracts, increase your confidence in reading and understanding them, and perhaps negotiating fairer terms, and in any event, understanding the contracts more fully so that you can more appropriately price the risks that you're prepared to assume. The last time we dealt with the basics, things like how to read a contract like a judge, particular language to look out for in a contract, as well as subcontracting considerations. Today, we're going to drill down a bit further on one very important aspect of construction contracts, and that is scope. Defining it well in the contract, and then the very important ancillary aspect of scope, which involves dealing with changes to scope and how the contract needs to address itself to change mechanisms so that you can perform the changes with hopefully a minimum of disruption and a minimum of conflict. We are privileged today to have a panel of speakers with wide experience in the industry, and I dare say the scars to prove it too. I'll let them introduce themselves. Let's go in alphabetical order, starting with Glenn. Mr. Ackerley?
Thank you, Geza, and good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's seminar. Really looking forward to walking through this topic with you. I'm the chair of the practice group at the law firm Weir Folds in Toronto. So I'm a construction lawyer that deals daily with construction contracts and construction issues and disputes on projects. And so that's my role here, is to provide the contractual, the legal input on contracts.
Thanks, Glenn. Alan?
Alan McIntosh. I'm the president of Marco Construction Group. We're an Atlantic Canadian-based general contractor, construction manager. I've been in the business for over 30 years, worked sort of my way up and kind of seen it all. For the most part, I'm dealing with the business origination aspect of our business. So I do see a lot of contracts, manage a lot of contracts, negotiate a lot of contracts. And then, as we'll probably touch on later, hand them over to people, and hopefully we've done that well, so that they can manage the process. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm pleased to be here.
Well, thank you. Finally, Trevor.
Hello, everyone. My name is Trevor Ostpugh. I'm a pre-construction manager with Graham Construction out of our Edmonton office here. So I'm also a general contractor, and my background's on the project execution delivery side of things. So much of my experience is also from learning lessons the hard way and getting those scars that Geza mentioned. So pleasure to be here. Nice to meet everyone.
Very good. Okay, so when you're talking about scope, there are different ways of slicing that one, and the way we've done it is to talk about what you're building, how you're building it, who's going to build it, and then what you have to do as you build it. And the focus again will be on the contractual aspects of all of these things and what you need to look out for in the construction contract on each one of these topics. So to start with, what are you building? We're going to lead off with you, Trevor. What do you need to look out for when you're thinking about what it is that you are building?
Yeah, so for what are we building? I always like to start is just truly understanding what the owner is asking to have done, and that's starts with just reviewing the documents provided, instructions, bidder, scopes of work summary, obviously the drawings, the specifications, the appendices, any reference codes or standards as applicable. It was brought up last webinar, so we want to mention it here. There's sometimes supplementary condition included around inferred scope, which usually has to do with concealed or unknown condition claims. So CCDC has a definition. based on careful investigation of the site prior to bid, or also what could be reasonably inferred from the contract documents. So that's something to watch out for if you come across that term. So I guess overarching kind of advice is really just there's no substitution for hard work. If you want to avoid some of the common pitfalls around, scope gaps or wrong discipline scope on the wrong discipline drawings, stuff that's drawn but not specified, or specified not drawn. Really to wrap your head around the job. There's no shortcut. You got to go through the page by page, detail by detail, really understand the scope. And that's the best way to make sure you're covered. And if you come across anything that you're not sure about or your foreseeable conflict, to send an RFI and just ask the question.
Okay. All right. Alan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, probably the only one I would add is, the codes and standards, and are they incorporated by reference? Because although the spec books are quite lengthy and trying to get through them, there are a lot of codes and references that are also embedded in there that are not provided. And I would use an example like the CSA 23.1, which would be the concrete materials methods of construction, which by accepting the contract and seeing those references, you would also be obligated to perform to those CSA standards that may not be described in the specs, but referenced.
Thank you, Alan. We just got a question from an attendee that he or she can't hear us. Does anyone else have that problem, or is it just specific to that one person? Okay, I'm getting lots of answers saying I can hear you or you're just fine. So I hope that one attendee solves the problem. All right, Glenn, before we move on, what do you have to add to this topic of what it is that you're building and how the contract needs to address itself to that?
Well, I think it's so important to stress throughout today's discussion, and Trevor and Alan alluded to it, is just the importance of getting your arms around the entire picture of what it is you have to do as it's laid out in the contract. And it does take work, as Trevor said, but beyond, drawings and specifications, look for appendices, exhibits, schedules attached to the back end of the contract. I've certainly seen situations where partway through the job, somebody goes, "Oh, wait a minute, we never looked at Exhibit Q," that was sort of buried at the back end. And it turns out there's some work involved, some task described in that schedule. So you really have to stand back and get your arms around the whole package and look at all the pieces that might set out what it is you have to do beyond drawings and specifications. We talked about the inferred scope issue. Even the CCDC2, the new 2020 version, mentions that you don't have to do things that aren't properly inferable from the drawings and specs. But of course, the flip side of that is that you do have to do things that are properly inferable. In other words, they may not be spelled out, but it's a natural expectation or implication of something that is on the drawings that you're also going to do the work that is implied by that. So you have to make sure you're clear on what that is. Not only would there be codes and standards, as Alan said, that you have to be aware of, CSA standards, for example, but be careful. I've seen situations where owners will sometimes refer to standard amendments or owner standard amendments to the contract that are not actually part of the package, but referred to elsewhere. So not just the standards and codes, but also other contract documents that are incorporated or brought into the contract by reference. Sometimes they'll say, refer to our website where a whole set of standard conditions, contractual conditions are found. So be careful about that. And then all of these references should be part of the contract by way of being listed in the contract documents. That's how they get all brought into the picture. So check that the list actually contains those things that are important to lay out what you've got to do. I couldn't emphasize more what Trevor said about if there's any uncertainty about any of this stuff, to reach out at the beginning and make a request for information, for clarification. That answer, whatever comes back, if it clears things up, great, but make sure that that answer is also listed and incorporated in the contract, so that there's no confusion later when you run across the same thing and somebody's decided that the answer wasn't appropriate or in conflict in some way or ambiguous. Make sure that answer is part of the contract. The final thing I'll mention before we move on, Geza, is that I understood from those who go through the exercise at the estimating stage of reviewing these drawings, the other thing you're going to form by a careful review is an impression about how good these drawings and specs are, the quality of the documents. And why do you care? Well, not only do you need to know, and it may lead to RFIs, need to know what you're doing, but it also gives you a sense of how much they may change. We'll talk about this a little later. How much what you're looking at the front end is going to evolve over time as things get figured out along the way. So change management, we're going to be talking about, becomes very important if you're looking at a set of drawings that are not really at 100%. There's some gaps that are going to need filling in. So be careful of that too, and be sort of anticipating down the road where this is going to go.
So what should a contractor do who sees that there are gaps or omissions in the drawings? Should the contractor simply sit by and quietly wait for the problem to manifest itself and then zap the owner with a change order? Or should the owner deal with the issue at the front end before signing the contract?
That's a commercial decision a lot of times, Gates. But you know, I think you need clarity because that makes for a good project. And trying to go into a project without that clarity eventually only leads to issues and conflict throughout the life of the project. So ask your RFIs early, level the playing field, so you get a fair representation and that everybody's looking at this. Even if your competitors see the questions that you're putting forth, at least it levels the playing field, and it will make for a better project for whoever ends up eventually getting the project. And you've shown to be a good partner on the onset of the project, that if you do get it, you've already built up that goodwill with the ownership group and the design community as well.
Trevor, would you agree with that approach?
Yeah, 100%. That was excellent advice from Alan. And the only thing I might add is if through asking the questions, if you're not getting the responses you need to clarify the scope properly, and there are these gaps in the drawings and specs, you always have the option to just not bid, and it's just too risky of a job, and just avoid it altogether.
Yeah. Before moving on, we do have a comment from an anonymous attendee who says that as an owner, I can say with 100% certainty that it is not a good business decision to wait and hit us with change orders. and I suspect that all of you would agree with that. All right, let's move on to how are you going to build it? And this deals with responsibility for design and means, methods, and so on. Alan, I think we're going to lead off with you on this one.
Sure. So who has a responsibility for design? I mean, a lot of times that's prescriptive on what the contract is, whether it's design, build, or not, but not always. So, you know, the contracts have a tendency to flow down, and from a general contractor to a subcontractor, what is in their responsibility or the subcontractor's responsibility, the GC's responsibility is means and methods a lot of times. And it's a term in construction to use to describe the techniques and tactics, usually temporary structures, where a contractor employs construction, temporary construction for a permanent result. I would look at things like formwork, false work, rigging, scaffolding, shoring, trenching. You know, they're not going to tell you how wide to excavate the trench or how to excavate the trench, just they need to put the pipe in the trench. So whether you use you know, shoring and trenching, piling, or what have you to accomplish that, that would be your responsibility as a contractor to do that. I would, although this isn't an insurance talk, I would probably recommend contractors verify that their GL policy accounts for that. And if it doesn't, they may want to discuss the professional liability coverage to pick up any of that. It can go on farther to other trades, steel connections, sprinkler design, things like that. So then we get into coordination among owners and designers, trades, and other contractors. And it starts with, you know, integration of the design by different design firm members within that team to make sure that we have a coordinated and verified set. A lot of times it'll turn to the contractor. It might be BIM coordination, and we need to know at what level we need to bring that BIM design to, and if we're providing a model or if the model is provided to us. So that's important, and what our responsibilities are on that. Supply chain coordination. We are, by means of accepting the contract and entering into the contract, that we are the experts in supply chain management and coordination, and we understand what's happening in the marketplace the best we can. And we're able to bid to that, we're able to speak to that, we're able to estimate and carry money in accordance with that. And there's an expectation that we would have coordinated that before we bid. Coordinating with government agencies, building permits, power, environmental, things like that. Again, our responsibility to coordinate that, and we take that responsibility on as well. And then just the integration of all the different building systems and how they go together and how they connect with each other and what happens to go first. Negative lap, positive laps, things like this. They may not explain exactly how to put an air vapor barrier on, but you've got to understand the difference between a negative lap and a positive lap. So then we get through things like constraints. Do we have constraints? Well, you know what? There might be billing constraints. You may only be able to bill a certain amount by the end of 2023, but perhaps you're going to do more work on that. So it could become a cash flow problem. There'd be site limit constraints, especially if you're working in an urban core. There might be air rights for cranes, local infrastructure, whether again, power lines are in your way, parklands that you can't work on. There could be time constraints, weather constraints, noise bylaw constraints. You might have to keep a minimum temperature during winter. You might have to keep it minimally lit during construction. These things you should be aware of. And then the last piece we talked about was reports. A lot of times we'll see a hazmat report, we'll see an ESA, we'll see a geotechnical report. A lot of times there's clauses in there that says these are providing for information only and that they're not to be relied upon. Great time to ask a question during that, so we get some clarity on what that is and what you want me to derive from that. Because again, you go back to what is inferred and what is not inferred. And if it is inferred that I should have reasonably expected something by reading these reports, we should be able to rely upon it. But again, ask your questions, get your RFIs out early, and try to get as much of this clarified as possible. And for our subcontractor community, I would be cognizant of the fact of what gets flown down to you and be aware of that.
Okay, that's great. Trevor, I know that you are particularly attuned to issues involving geotech reports, site condition reports, and so on that are given to the contractor by the owner. Sometimes in circumstances where it is said to the contractor, well, here's our information, but you can't rely on it. How do you handle that as a contractor?
Yeah, it's a dangerous statement to be made, because essentially it affects contractors' ability to make any sort of concealed or unknown condition claim or a differing site condition claim. Because in order to make a differing site condition claim, it needs to be, you need to establish that it's materially different from the contract documents. And if the geotechnical report or hazardous material report or whatever is not a contract document, you've not established the basis for what's materially different. So it's dangerous when that statement is made, and ultimately you'll, if it is made, you'll likely end up need to do your own geotechnical report or assessment. You end up making it redundant and expending some extra resources to get those documents, which is why best practice is if the owners or the consultants have them in advance, they make them available to the contractors, state them as contract documents, and then it avoids the redundant effort and costs from all the contractors.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, I know that you advise a lot of owners. Just to put you on the spot, my friend, what advice do you give owners about these various reports that owners commission? Should they bite the bullet and say, yeah, here's our stuff, and yes, you can rely upon it, or do you advise them to tell contractors that they can't rely upon it? What do you do?
Well, I think part of it, Geza, is recognizing that in the tendering period, there really is no opportunity, despite what Alan might have said. Practically speaking, there's no opportunity to go and start digging boreholes in the site in the 2 weeks or a month or whatever it is you've got to pull a bid together. And so, as an owner, to answer your question, you're really putting contractors in an impossible position. If you say, here's the geotechnical information, but figure it out yourself, you go do whatever, but we're not going to allow you the time to go do it, right? It's just completely untenable as a position. What I find makes a lot more sense, and I certainly encourage owners to do, is to say, okay, let's use this report. It may be right, it may be wrong, but let's use it as setting the base case. The threshold, what if it's a particular soil strength that's reported, whatever, we'll operate on the basis that that's the base case. So if it turns out to be significantly different, that is a changing condition, and you recognize that, because any other way puts the contractor in an impossible position. I think it's the fairest way to go. It's not guaranteeing the information's correct. It's saying this is the basis we're going to operate on, and if the condition is significantly different from that reported, then we all realize that's something that needs to be addressed through changes, which we can talk about.
Okay. Any other comments, Glenn, before we move on?
Just a couple of things. Just picking up on Alan did a great job of listing all the different types of categories of things to look at. In terms of design, we touched on already. I just want to underscore that there is typically a responsibility on the contractor not to do the design work itself in a traditional model, but to review the design and put up your hand and say, there's a problem. And because this is about contracts, I want to point out that most contracts drafted by owners through supplementary conditions will go on to say, and if you don't conduct that review and speak up, you're going to lose the ability to claim either time or money or some combination of the two later when the problem kind of appears. So you are obliged to roll up your sleeves and check for problems, coordination among drawings that isn't there and so on, and do not hesitate to speak up. I think that's one of the key messages today. In terms of means and methods, I think the important thing there is just to realize that what you assume is probably the case isn't always the case. That you say, well, as a contractor, I'm in charge of means and methods, and most contracts like the CCDC2 say so. But there are owners who say, I want you to do it this way or that way. A particular, jack and bore, for example, in terms of tunneling, a particular method is actually specified. So you have to be mindful that whatever you thought would be the best practice to approach a particular task in the job may not be what's specified. And if it's a real problem, then, and I've seen this, put your hand up at that early stage and say, owner, are you really sure you want it done this way? Because a better way, more efficient and cost-effective way is this way. And then the owner may take it away and say, you're right, and issue an addendum. So think about means and methods, and not just assuming that whatever you want to do is correct. It may be that the contract says otherwise.
Okay, let's move on to who is going to build it. And this is the topic of subs and suppliers, and the contractual aspects involving subcontractors and suppliers, particularly insofar as it concerns scope. And Alan, I think you were going to lead off on this one.
Sure. So retaining subcontractors for us, it would start at the invite stage and the pre-qualification stage. Are you pre-qualifying trades? Are you accepting qualified offers, or you're not accepting qualified offers? Have you been clear on what you've been asking them? And have you provided all the required information? If you are intending to sign a certain type of contract, that should be identified, and all the pertinent information should be provided to all bidders. Then we get into, we receive bids, we're doing bid leveling, we're doing comparisons, and now we're trying to allocate scope among trades. And there'll always be clauses in the documents that sit back and say specification sections do not define the scope of work of particular trades, but we do it anyhow as a general contractor, and we write specification sections in. And I would ask the sub-trades to read that, review the scope, and look at the related sections. So for example, you might be a masonry contractor, but a related section might be 79,000, which would be sealants as applicable to your trade. So what is applicable? Am I doing fire stopping and smoke seals? Am I doing it in beds? Things like that. Try to be as clear as you can. Try to ask for a pre-award meeting if you can, if the contractor doesn't offer one to you, so you can lay it all out, look at the schedule, and figure out exactly when you're to be responsible, what constraints are in your way, and what have you. Contract details, get them in writing. That's important. What are your payment terms? What are your responsibilities towards safety? Who purchases the major equipment? And then when I look at sub-trade risk. You've got contractual risk. There's flow down from the prime contractor. There's performance risk. Do you have to provide surety? Schedule risk, delay, damages, limits. What are your responsibilities? Financial risk. Do you have cash flow restraints? Are you going to have to lay out cash flow to ramp up before you're actually going to get paid? So then we kind of go down to, I'll skip over procuring coordinated utilities. I think we touched on that one before. But on the supply chain issues, again, as a contractor or subcontractor, you are recognized as an expert in your field, and you should have, by virtue of bidding the project, investigated the supply chain, understand the time frame, understand the costs, the limited availability, bake that into your proposal or your bid. That's being assumed that has been done, how you've mitigated that. And I don't think that there's a get out of jail free card because you haven't done that once you sign that contract. That would be assumed, inferred, whatever words Glenn would like to use there. So that's sort of my nuts and bolts of who's going to build it.
Okay, Trevor?
Yeah, that was great. Good summary by Alan. Maybe the only thing I'll build off on is, just because it is such a hot topic these days, the supply chain issues and long lead times that we're seeing and have just escalated significantly in the past few years. Identifying those risks, putting in plans to mitigate those risks with initiating the shop drawings and procurement process as early as possible, or is there any substitution options available with shorter lead times? And we're starting to see owners being forced to get creative with their procurement of their major material and equipment. In order to meet their schedule, they're having to initiate that procurement before the tender even starts. So then we're starting to see some like novation agreements where the vendor agreement with the owner is then assigned to the contractor through the tender, and they're having to assume that risk of whatever the terms were that the owner agreed to with the equipment vendors up front. So it's significant enough of a risk item that worth highlighting and investigating further.
Okay, Glenn?
Just a few things that really arise from this relationship Alan was talking about between general contractors as subcontractors in relation to scope. Because of course the owner says, this is what I want done. And then as Alan explained, you got to take that as a GC and hand it to trades. And trades have to, similarly, the subcontractors have to understand what they're being asked of. And the way that that's achieved can vary widely. So you, as a subcontractor, have to pay attention to the series in terms of reading your subcontract, because what is being laid on your lap will vary widely. There are those who will say, these are the specific tasks I want you to do, as GCs, I mean, and then those that say, here's the prime contract, there you go, everything in here that relates to you, you're responsible for. Could be a very short subcontract, but it makes it very difficult to get your mind around as a subcontractor what that is. It can be very confusing. Now, it's a way of avoiding gaps from a GC's perspective, but it makes it very confusing. So for example, some of the key clauses that you might see are things about liquidated damages, for example. The prime contract may have damages assigned to the project for as it's late, here's what you have to pay. How is that being handed down to subcontractors individually? Or the other key concept in this space is equivalent project relief. You'll hear that phrase used. And that's a clause that a GC contractor puts into a subcontract that says, you only get, in terms of additional compensation, for example, what it is that I get from the owner. Those are the kinds of clauses when you're talking about contracting between subs and GCs, the kinds of clauses you have to pay attention to. The only other thing I'll add is talking about materials and long lead items and supply chain problems is the role you'll sometimes see you have to pay attention to in your contract of owner supplied items. The owner may have secured the supply of a piece of equipment or some other material that is being given to the contractor to use in the project. And you have to be very careful in the contract about those kind of situations, transfer of ownership and responsibility for protecting those materials, and what happens if they're late. We'll talk about timing and delay and schedule issues in a later seminar, but all those things are tied to where are the materials coming from, because sometimes they're coming from an owner or an owner's other contract. So you have to look carefully at the contract for those types of provisions too.
Okay. Well, just before we go on, you know, another red flag, since we were this webinar series talks a lot about red flags, and another red flag is this equivalent project relief concept, because it raises other issues that we could go on and on about. But if you're a subcontractor and you are presented with a contract by a GC that incorporates this equivalent project relief idea. In other words, you get what we get, note it, get advice on it, and be careful about signing it, because there are other considerations. This is a concept that comes out of P3s that seems to be filtering into the rest of the industry. So it's just a heads up about that. But let's keep going, guys. What do you have to do as you build it? And I think, Glenn, you're going to lead off on this one. This has to do with the mechanics of building and insofar as the contract concerns.
Sure. So when you're reviewing the contract, and we've talked already today about reviewing the drawings and specs, you know, what is this building that you're being asked to build? What's involved in it? That's one thing. But in the contract, there are a bunch of other to-dos, a bunch of tasks that are assigned to you as a contractor, and by extension as a subcontractor, that aren't just directly related to the building project itself, but everything around it, sort of the how this is going to happen, how people are going to interact with each other along the way as the project unfolds. And you should be reviewing these items very carefully too. There's a list of some examples here up on the slide. You know, who's running site meetings? How often do they happen? What kind of progress reports, narrative reports is the owner demanding be provided as the project unfolds? Invoicing requirements, but particularly in this newer environment we're in Ontario, Alberta, and elsewhere, a proper invoice is as part of prompt payment. Look at the contract, and we'll talk about payment in another webinar, but this is the what do you have to do to get paid question in the contract. What does it say about that? What does it say about providing schedule updates? These are tasks. They're part of your scope of work. Health and safety measures. What do you have to do in terms of providing reports? The notice of project, for example, that may be required to be filed with the ministry. Have you got that? Site security requirements, things like that. How do you manage substances on the contract? So these are all the types of things that I don't think you should pay little attention to as compared to the building piece. These are in some cases as important. They keep at least from a contract perspective, they're setting out what your obligations are. And the final point I'll just mention, you see there, is throughout a contract, there are many, many instances where owners demand that you give notice of something you've discovered has come to light. And you have to give notice within a period of time so that they can absorb it, the consultant and the owner can figure out what to do. And if you don't give that notice within time as required, then sometimes you're stuck dealing with the issue as a contractor or perhaps a subcontractor yourself. So a key part of this scope of work, the to-do list, is giving notices as and when required. Can't emphasize that enough.
On this subject of notices, Alan, I know that you have a lovely turn of phrase about all of this, which is, when and how do you give the owner the bad news? So right. What do you do? What do you do? How do you handle the notice issue in your contracts?
Probably a step above before that, you and Glenn had talked about these flow down provisions of relief and things like that. So, I would ask our subtrade community to understand what constraints we also have when we give notice. So just because you've given me notice, it doesn't maybe it doesn't allow me to then give the owner notice because time has passed. So be aware of that, because we obviously want to assist the project to move forward in the best means possible. So I would do that. Getting back to giving them the bad news, I think when we talked about it earlier, is it bad news or is it just the reality? And I think you have to frame it in that sort of way that either through nobody's fault or what have you, this is where we are today, whether it's supply chain, whether it's manpower productivity, whether it's a lack of manpower or whatever the case may be. Do your best to explain it on a soft sell and talk about it and talk through. And then unfortunately, you have to paper it at some point in time on the back end and walk through that. People are human. I like to think that they will treat you human as well if you lay the cards out and you're being open and honest and transparent in what's happening. You also have to show that you've given reasonable efforts to mitigate. And if you've not done that, then that's on you. So get your ducks in a row ahead of time. Show what you've done to mitigate. Be open to finding a different solution if it happens to be, and work with your subtrade community and the suppliers to come up with the best plan B that you can come up with, and at least put that in front of the owner. So at least they look that you've come here armed with something to help them, other than dropping a problem in their lap. And before we touch on that, I just want to go back on one of the things that Glenn had talked about when talking about invoicing. And I think it's important when you read the contract to understand how you get paid. Do you get paid for materials only on site, or can you get paid for materials on site? Can you get paid for materials off-site storage, which is going to be increasingly important as we go through supply chain issues? Can you get deposits? And will you have a cash flow problem if you don't, in order to meet schedule? So do you need to meet schedule and have to lay out a bunch of cash to get product and store it off site that you're not going to get paid for until you incorporate it into the job? So I think that's very important as well when we touched on invoicing earlier. So.
Okay, Trevor, what do you have to say about this one?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add, which was kind of alluded to, and it reminded me of a comment that you may actually made last webinar, Geza, which was really just having your complete project team review the contract documents, because different people will catch different risks. Like your execution team will catch some of the administrative risks around schedule updates and progress reports and project controls reporting. Your safety folks will catch prime contractor risks and other contractors that might need to work in your area. Your accounting and finance folks will catch invoicing requirements and payment lead times and that such thing. So just getting the complete project team members to review the contract and look at their area of expertise and help flush out some of those risk items.
Yeah, as Alan was talking, I was thinking of that very thing, Trevor. And this business about being attuned to cash flow or cash flow issues. Now, that's something that your commercial folk are going to be particularly focused on. And yet, if I understood you, Alan, your point is, well, there are cash flow implications arising in other places in the contract, in terms of invoicing requirements, but also delivery requirements, the need for storage, and so on and so on. So it really is important to have as many people lay eyes on the contract and come at it from their own perspectives. Okay, we are quickly using up our time. It's been a good conversation, but let's move on to the other important part of our webinar today, which is change, managing change. And Glenn, why don't you lead us off on the subject of change generally, and then we'll dig into management and move to Q&A.
Sure. Well, of course, as we all appreciate, change is just inevitable on a construction project. There's bound to be changes. And so the point here is just to stress in the contract, what does it say if there is a change? What does it say about changes? It's a very important subject matter within contracts. Obviously, there'll be provisions say the owner is allowed to make changes. Why the owner's making changes? It may be actually the designer wanting to make changes for some reason. Maybe it's an improvement. Maybe it's some omission. They forgot something. It's got to be added. It could be that everybody ran into a problem nobody expected on site that wasn't shown, for example, in the geotechnical reports we were talking about or other site investigation. And then finally, another source of changes is a change in law. And I'll just pause to say that is an area that was engaged through the COVID pandemic, where contractors saying, well, now I've been required by changes to health and safety regulations to do various things on the job site that are impacting my work. And so how is that addressed in the contract? Regulatory or legal changes? Who takes responsibility for that? But these are all sources of change. And as Alan said, the importance of keeping the project going in the face of these changes is reflected in this obligation to mitigate the impact to the extent possible. And often contracts will require contractors to take steps in the face of changes, particularly unforeseen changes, to mitigate the impact of those changes, to lessen the impact to the extent possible so that the owner isn't facing a huge claim. But those are the types of changes, and maybe we can get in a moment now to the sort of methodology around them. But those tend to be the types of categories. There will be provisions when I say read your contract. For example, if we're going to talk about the supplemental instruction tool, but it may be that if you ask a clarification and you get an instruction what to do, you're then required by contract to put your hand up and say, well, what you're asking me to do is different from what I was going to do. And therefore it's a change. And again, if you don't speak up, the contract says, if you don't notify us that what we're telling you to do is a change, then you're stuck doing it at no additional time or money. So again, the wording in the contract around changes that arise is so important to pay attention to.
Yeah, well, let's get right to it about how do you how to manage change. And Trevor, I think you wanted to lead off on this most important topic.
Yeah,
How
I'll
do you
just
manage change?
a quick, I guess, summary of the hierarchy of change management vehicles. So first we have the supplemental instruction, and then just as described, it's an instruction, a clarification, an extra detail issued to supplement the contract documents where there is no adjustment in contract price or contract time, which is the important distinction there. Next is a change directive. So that's a change in the work involving an adjustment in contract price or time, but it's issued prior to there being an agreement in place on the amount. So in this case, the work proceeds on a cost plus basis in the interim until a price can be agreed upon and a corresponding change order issued. So these are used in instances where the work is urgent and cannot wait for a formal change order to be issued. If the work has too many variables or unknowns to properly quantify the price or schedule impact in advance, or the owner and contractor simply can't agree on a price and schedule adjustment and decide to just move forward on a cost plus basis. And the last one is a change order, which everyone's probably most familiar with. So again, this is a change in the work involving an adjustment in contract price or time, but where the agreement is reached in advance prior to proceeding the work on what that adjustment is. So these will usually be preceded by a proposed change notice for the contractor to provide a quote of the effects of the change on the project for the owner to approve in advance. There are occasionally contractor initiated or unsolicited change order requests that aren't in response to a PCN. And these are technically a claim for financial consideration that should usually follow a notice. So those are the three sort of change management vehicles, and maybe just to touch on a few of the common pitfalls. One is to use the proper naming convention. I'll often encounter teams that use a whole host of fabricated change documents that they've used in the past on previous projects that aren't applicable to the current contract. So that's your field authorizations and site instructions and work order authorizations and authorizations to proceed and a whole host of other names. And this can get you in trouble, especially if an issue gets escalated and you now have a mediator or a judge making a decision based only on the relevant contract documents. That could get you in trouble if you're using non-conventional naming and contract forms. Another common pitfall is changes through shop drawings. Quite simply, don't do them. Shop drawings are not a proper change management vehicle, and any desired changes through the shop drawings should be executed through a parallel site instruction, change directive, or change order. And the last one I'll remind as a red flag is if there's a proposed change notice that affects work in progress or work that is about to start, the proper approach is for the owner or consultant to issue a change directive to stop the work while that change is being contemplated. Because what can often happen is there'll be a proposed change that affects ongoing work. The contractor will instinctively stop while we debate this change. And if the change doesn't go ahead, well, then the contractor's left with saying, well, you impacted my schedule because we were debating this change. And then the owner and consultant will say, well, we never told you to stop, technically. And then the contractor doesn't have a proper change vehicle to make a schedule extension claim. So that's a common one that can get easily missed. And I'll get off my soapbox now and turn it over to Alan or Glenn if they have any other.
Yeah, I guess I would just be cognizant of the fact that the overuse of supplemental instructions when either a CD or CO would have been the better vehicle. And, you know, when you talk about scars and war wounds, we do see that, and it needs to be brought to a head early in the process, because things that are compensable a lot of times are issued as an SI, and then you have to fight to get it moved to the column of CD or CO. So I think those things be aware of if you see that happening, and try to bring it to a head a little early in the process.
Glenn?
And I would just tack on at the back end of this discussion, the fact that if you go ahead with the work without any of these documents in place, you're doing it at great risk. But it happens all the time. And this is the challenge we face, where contractors are told, well, we got to do this. They go ahead and do it. There's no CD in place, no change directive, certainly no change order. It's not even clear about whether the instruction authorized proceeding, and yet the work's undertaken. And then at the back end, you're fighting over the value of that and the price of it and whether it was reasonable and all of that. So far better, if you can, put up your hand and say, the contract requires one of these documents in place before I proceed. So give me the document and I'll proceed. That's the best practice in terms of proceeding on these.
And I see it, you know, the onus is, you know, quickly negotiate the change order, you know, quickly get an authorization to proceed, make your schedule adjustments and send them out with the change order if you can. And then be prepared to deal with, you don't get any additional time. There's no cumulative effect of change orders. Oh, and by the way, it's been offset by credits and removed work. So again.
Yeah. What do you do if, you know, you're issued a supplemental instruction? The contract doesn't allow supplemental instructions as a change management tool, but you're issued one. And you go to the owner and you say, well, you know, this is going to cost, this is a change. It's going to cost money. And I'm looking for either a CD or a CO. And the owner says, no, there's no change here. Just do the work. What do you guys do?
They can direct you to do the work under the contract, and often that's where you get to. And we will proceed with the work under protest and keep a record of it. And when we submit our monthly updates and our logs and our RFIs or COs or shop drawing logs, that will obviously be part of it with a price on it, and it will keep resurfacing. And look, if it's one or two and it's not a big deal, the job's gone well, everybody's probably favorable and it'll get resolved. But if it's habitual, then unfortunately you're building a claim.
Geza, I just add quickly for everybody's sake, again, in the contract may lie the answer to the question, in the sense that if you go back and are told, forget it, it's part of your scope, get on with it. As Alan just said, that under Part 8 of the contract in the CCDC family contract is something the consultant may direct you to do, but it's without prejudice to your ability to claim later that it actually was a change. But the important thing is, if the consultants made that ruling, that determination, remember in the contract, there's a period of time to object to it. You know, the working under protest phrase Alan just used, you have to do something with it. You can't just stand back and say, I disagree and get on with life. You have to actually object. So be careful again in the contract, what it says about objecting to decisions like that, but this isn't a change and you think it is. You've got to take an action.
One more time when we have to read the contract, Glenn. One more thing to read.
That's it.
And we're quickly running out of time. Glenn, why don't you wrap up with the key takeaways, and then I'll take a look at the Q&A, see what we have.
Sure. Well, of course, as we all appreciate, and as you heard again today, it really is important to study the drawings and specs and everything else that's inferred, implied, brought in by reference. Really understand what you have to do. And also that includes the contractual things you have to do in addition to the building piece of it. Be careful how you download and allocate among the subcontractors the work. both contractually as well as the scope, because you don't want to have gaps as a general contractor. You want to make sure everybody's appropriately sharing the risk. And as we were just talking about, follow the contract when changes do happen, which they're going to happen. Make sure you speak up if it truly is a change. You object if you're being told it isn't a change. Get something on paper if you can to authorize the work being done under a change for later resolution, and so on. And then finally, as we've all been emphasizing, be clear under the contract what's required about notices, and make sure you give them as and when they're required. That, I think, Geza, is the real list of key takeaways from today.
Well, thank you. Looking at the questions and comments, we don't have too many. I'll go to the last one here. Nathan Hawkins, how do you instruct use of cash allowance as approved in the tender/contract budget? Either of you guys want to tackle that one? How do you instruct use of cash allowances approved in the tender contract budget?
They're normally pretty prescriptive in the contract on how cash allowances are to be used. It's normally direct costs only. You're to bake in your overhead profits, fees, things like that in your bid when you carry that cash allowance, and it becomes a direct cost only. I would be careful, because we've seen it, again, talking about war wounds, where perhaps there's a cash allowance that is undefined, or it's a cash allowance that gets moved from doing one thing to now doing something else, and it becomes non-compensable. So you may need to get some advice if that happens, and you may need to get some advice if you see cash allowances that are undefined, because pretty much it's a way to deal with change orders without providing you appropriate markup. And I think that's a bit offside.
Yeah.
I'll agree with Alan there and say that we'll usually use cash allowances for the known unknowns, so stuff that we know the work we need to do, but we just can't quantify it in terms of a fixed price, which is different from the unknown unknowns, which is typically your contingency bucket. So as Alan mentioned, just being really careful and prescriptive around what is and isn't included in that cash allowance bucket, help avoid future arguments around changes for that dollar amount.
Okay. And I'll end it with John Boxtall's comment from earlier on in our session about owners' site investigations and so on. And his comment is, what's the point of an owner conducting investigations that they then declare to be unreliable? Pay for the investigation, acknowledge its implications, make it the basis of the contract conditions, and then manage the risk accordingly.
Here, John. Well done. Well said.
The owner owns the site, so don't they own the risk of what the site provides? John asks. Well, I think I would get agreement from all of you on that comment. So I see that we are bumping into the timeline for there are no more substantive questions. We're bumping into the timeline. There's one last thing that the CCA would like us to do, and that's a poll. And this will only take a minute. And there's the first, well, there are the questions on the poll. How would you rate today's webinar content? From very satisfied to dissatisfied. And number two, whether or not you look forward to the next one on May 1st. Would each of you please answer the poll, and then we'll let you know what the answers are. I trust we'll let people know what the answers are, right, CCA? Well, that's very nice. Thank you for that. We appreciate that. So, well over 90% of you are satisfied or very satisfied, and 99% of you are looking forward to the next one, and as are we. That's on May 1st. So with another exciting aspect of construction contracts, and I just want to sign off by saying what a pleasure it was moderating the three of you gentlemen. It's been a lot of fun, and thank you for participating, and thank you to the audience, and we'll see you all on May the 1st.